Hi, this is T with TeaQuilts, and I'm here today to do a Scrappy binding, but I'm also going to sew the binding completely onto the quilt by using my sewing machine. I'm not going to do any handwork on it, and I just wanted to show you the process. This quilt that I'm putting it on is a Scrappy Stacks quilt, and I thought it would be perfect for the Scrappy binding because it has a white edge for my final border, so the colors would really pop off of it. Another thing that I did is I'm using actually leftover binding from previous projects, and then I also added some strip sets that were left over from some of the fabrics inside the quilt, but I really just did that so that I could pull some of the fabrics that were in the quilt into the binding area. So what I do is I start out with leftover binding strips, and sometimes I'll piece these as I make quilts. I'll just sew these together, but this time I just went to my sewing machine and connected this whole string of binding together. Now, because I'm using leftover binding strips, most of these have already been pressed in half, so all I have to do is from where the connections are, once I trim, I'm just basically pressing the folded strips in half from where I pressed the seams, because I've already done that part. So for the most part, so I'm only pressing, say, maybe 3 inches from each seam connection. So I will do that and I will come back. Okay, so I have cut a 1/4 inch seam and then press the entire strip set in half, just like you would with any regular binding. Just one step I want to share with you. This is a second piece that I have in my collection, and I'm not actually using this on my quilt, but I wanted to show you what I do. When I finish with my binding, I just roll it onto itself, and I do this all the way down the strip set till I get to the end, and then I either store the binding if I'm not using it right away, or if I'm using it, then I will show you my next step. So I'm going to continue to do this all the way down the strip set, and I'm going to show you one that I already have completed. So this one I have completed all the way down the strip set, and it's enough binding for me to put onto my quilt top. If I was not going to put this on my quilt top right now, I'll just stick a pin in there to hold it closed so nothing gets wrinkled and it stays nice and flat, and then I store these in plastic containers. So I will show you my next step. Okay, I'm back and I'm at my sewing machine, and I wanted to show you the reason why I roll my binding. Most machines have an extra thread spool, so if you're trying to do twin needle sewing and you have 2 different threads, you can run it from your machine. Well, mine sit right here, and I put this on top, and what I do is I take my binding that I put into the roll and I put it into this little hole in the center and use that like it's a thread spool. So I just sit it right there, and I sit it so that the fold is down, so if it's any friction it won't do any additional fraying up on the top. Now I'm just going to sew just a little bit so I can show you what I do. I'm not going to do the whole quilt because I need to make a label that I need to add to the back first before I complete the whole project. But I will pull this out and it just rolls just like thread. See that? And it's not all over my shoulder, it's not on the floor, it's not all over my workspace, it's nicely contained right here. So I'm going to angle my camera down to the sewing machine. Okay, so I got my binding coming off the top, and I'm just going to start on this corner and then go around the corner. I'm going to sew almost one long length, and then I'm going to stop and show you how I sew it to the back. First thing I do is I use a pin to mark my spot of where I want to stop sewing when I sew this binding down. So I'm going to leave a tail of about 10 inches or so, doesn't really matter. And then I'm using an open toe foot for this. I sometimes use my 1/4 inch foot, but my open toe foot is a lot more sturdy, so I prefer to use it instead. I just put my needle into the sewing position where it still gives me a 1/4 inch from the right edge. I want to cut on my automatic back tack and cut feature if you have that on your machine as well. And I'm going to sew with about a 2.3 stitch length. I normally piece with 2.0. And right now I'm just sewing with my regular sewing threads. I do have a color bobbin in my machine, and that's because I'm just trying to use it up. It really doesn't matter at this step, so I don't really care. So I'm just folding my binding back to the edge of the quilt. Fold it back down on itself. And then I just use this pin to hold it in place. Now I have a thread tail hanging back here that I'm just going to go ahead and clip so I don't have to worry about those when I'm finished. So now I'm going to turn the corner. And I'm going to start on the edge of the quilt. And it's going to do the back tack for me. And I continue to sew this binding onto the quilt. I'm going to stop a little ways. Cut my threads. And I'm actually going to go ahead and put in a bobbin that has kind of like ecru color thread, because I'm dealing with a quilt that has a lot of colors. I could use like gray, any kind of natural color. That's one of the reasons why I'm sewing it on by machine, because I didn't want to change all those thread colors by hand. So it'll look better by machine with a lot of colors than by hand with a lot of color when you're only using one thread. So now the problem is, since I'm not putting this all the way on, I'm going to have to remove my roll and secure it some kind of way. Is for me to press these seams out first, and then once I press them out, I'm going to press them under like so. So I don't have, so I got this part, and then I will be going down the entire length of the quilt, so I can do some finger pressing while the iron heats up. Okay, so I've got the binding pressed out, and then I turn it around, fold my corner in, and make sure that it's going over the line. Get a good press. So I want to cover this stitch line. So then I fold down again, press this corner in, and then I'll just stick a pin in here to hold it down. And I want to put my pins, I want to make sure that my pins are extending on the outside so that I can see it. So again, I just go ahead and press this whole side. Once I press the entire side, I'll come back and show you the next step. Okay, I'm back down at the last corner. So I'm going to press that over, make my miter, and fold it back on itself. Okay, so from the front of the quilt, I am going to be stitching right along this stitching here. And so since my fabric border is white, whatever color my border is, that's the color thread that I use when I'm stitching. So I'm going to first change out my thread to white. I'm going to change my needle position to center. And I'm all prepped for that part. Now what I need to do is pin but when I pin, okay, so I'm going to start from the other end just because I can see it better. Okay, so I'm hoping you can see the stitching line here from me sewing my binding on. So what I want to do is I want to pin so that I know that I am covering my line. And I will tell you that I have used the Wonder Clips for this, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, because I have to take the Wonder Clips out earlier than I do when I pin. So I will come back and it may not stitch all of this down and I will have flaps. So I prefer to use pins because I can take the pins out at the absolute last second. And that's enough for now. It's not going to be a lot of stitching, but you'll get the general idea. Now, one other thing I want to talk about is that you could use one of your decorative stitches if you want to, but I like just using my straight stitch because then the binding looks more like it's been done by hand at first appearance. This time I'm going to put my stitch length at 2.5. And I want to just go right past the pin that starts, and I'm right in the ditch. Let me zoom in a little bit for you. Okay. So I've taken the camera off the tripod just so I can show you that I'm stitching right in this ditch. So you can see my needle is in that down position right after this pin. So I'm not stitching that pin. And then I'm going to stitch slowly and come down and stitch in this ditch. So I'm going to put this back on the tripod and then I'm going to show you the results. This time I do not have my back stitch on. So I'm going to pull that pin. So I'm stitching on the white right in the edge as close as possible to that binding without hitting the binding. And then when my underside go on, I'm taking my hand and making sure that this is flat when I sit it onto my throat plate. And I forgot to pull 2 pins. I normally pull my pins 1 stitch before the pin, so. So now I'm down in the corner, and normally if I'm sewing binding where the color thread I'm using on top matches the binding fabric as well, I'll go ahead and stitch my corners down as well, or I will go back at the end and do that part by hand. But since this is a yellow corner and I'm using white thread, it's not going to be that obvious, so I'll show you what I do. But what I do is what I do is I have my binding miter as a guide, and so what I do is I just turn my machine and stitch down that miter. And then once I get there, I turn it back around and come back down that same miter. And I'm not necessarily stitching on the miter, and I'm having difficulty pushing it back. Sometimes that happens. So what I do is I pull it back to the back, and then I just use my reverse stitch. I don't have my cutter on at this time. I get back into position, turn the quilt back around, and I have no pins over here, so I'm just going to try to flatten out a piece to come down the corner, and I just continue on down this corner. And I'm gonna stop right here because I do need to finish my binding. Okay, so I'm gonna go back up where it's better lighting, and I'm gonna show you how it's stitched out. Okay, so I'm back, and I actually started stitching. I haven't clipped anything. I left my pin showing so I can show you where I stopped, where I started my stitching. And so then here's a close-up of the stitched area. I stitched in a ditch right along here, all the way down through to this corner. Okay. So this is how it looks on the back. Here's my corner. And then here's the stitching of the binding being sewn down. And I did miss a spot right here, and that's what I was talking about. If you use the clips, you can have giant spots that are missed. And I just didn't spread that, I didn't press it flat when I put it onto the bed of the machine. But for the most part, you can see where it's stitched out perfectly from the machine. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.